Vladimir Putin has invaded another Ukrainian province. Just why is he expanding the war? I thought President Trump said he wanted peace. Just why, and more importantly, how is he going about it? Plus, we're going to talk about the Russian complete dismissal of any peace overtures and if anyone is going to summon a response. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's crack into it. Okay, so this is the biggest story here. You can see there's a little bit of action here in the Kursk area. Now, what's worth noting is, of course, you might recall the Ukrainians conducted an operation pushing into Kursk, attempting to sort of create a bargaining chip of Russian territory held by Ukrainian forces. And while now Russians have pushed them out, limiting the Ukrainians to a few small wooded areas of Russian sovereign territory, literally just a few dozen meters or a few hundred meters, what's more troubling is that we're seeing now Russian forces aren't stopping at the border. Instead, they've decided they are going to push deep towards Sumy. In fact, this account reports that the Russians, or at least the Russian Ministry of Defense, claims that they have occupied the Lochnia village of Sumy. And this is, of course, a stepping stone on the way to the city of Sumy. Now, it is a long stepping stone. Based on current trends, it would likely take Russia probably 2 to 3 years to make it to the city of Sumy if they could at all. But this trend reflects a troubling shift in Russian policy. It says that Russia isn't content to fight over these contested regions, instead saying, well, I think I can annex more and more of this territory. And we have discussed this at length on this channel, that fundamentally the Russians are starting to believe they are winning and that the West and Ukraine is unable and unwilling to resist them in any meaningful way. And that's not just a function of Russia's expansion of the conflict into more regions, including Sumy, Kharkiv, even reportedly Chernihiv, but Russia has also launched the largest strike since the start of the war on Kiev, right? With multiple waves of explosions hitting Kiev last night in one of the absolute largest attacks of ballistic missiles and drones. And we're going to talk a little bit about why this was so exceptionally effective, but what it should be really taken as Vladimir Putin dropping the mask and saying, hey, we made these overtures for peace simply to stall out and to create additional confusion in the U.S. Electorate and among Europeans, but primarily the United States. And so in order to create this sort of bewildering confusion, there would be weird lulls in fighting. You might recall Vladimir Putin offering these sort of random truces with various constraints, none of which actually occurred on the battlefield, right? They were just performances. And so the fact is that even that mask of a performance, a mask of truce or whatever else, is simply been dropped. And now Russia is ramping up its attacks on Ukraine. And we're going to talk about why these attacks were so unusually effective, and more importantly, the diplomatic shift that Russia has made. But I wanted to mention, guys, one note is that you probably have noticed that I am critical of the U.S. policy on this, and not just in the Trump administration, but also in the Biden administration as well. And that means that sponsors and advertisers, especially in this era, they are not keen to associate themselves with a critic of the administration, which again, I don't consider myself like a critic. I'm just a guy who calls it as I see it. And I can do that because you guys have my back, right? Over on Combat Vet News, right? Membership here functions exactly like a Patreon. You become a member and you get access not only to the Tuesday and Thursday uncensored combat videos, then that drop straight from the front lines, some of the craziest footage we have access to, but also the archive going back to the start of the war. This is all the stuff YouTube would never let me show you in a million years. That's why it's self-hosted. Even Patreon wouldn't let me show you this stuff. Plus, if you want to really support me and become a lieutenant or colonel tier member, you get the by name shout outs. And of course, you get access to the weekly Q&As where you can ask me literally anything. So check it out at combatvetnews.com. Now, here's one of the things that I thought was fascinating is that this shift in Russian military policy has also been accompanied by a shift in Russian diplomatic stances, at least their public diplomatic stance. And for example, Sergei Lavrov has actually demanded now that any future peace agreement in Ukraine include conditions to prevent the election and establishment of future pro-Western governments. This is interesting only to anyone else who has not done the analysis, right? And we've talked about the fact that Russia, since the start of the war, has had this strange position that has had kind of everybody scratching their heads, called the denazification of Ukraine. This is the Russian propaganda position that the Ukrainian government is actually loaded with Nazis. And there are no neo-Nazi parties that win any meaningful amount of votes in Ukraine. Worth noting, Zelensky is actually Jewish. Seems very unlikely that a neo-Nazi dominated government would put a Jewish leader at its helm. But facts never got in the way of Putin's propaganda. However, the reality is, that's the propaganda, is Ukraine is loaded with Nazis, we need to get them out. And that serves Putin's propaganda point quite well, because he wants to link in the Russian public's mind the Soviet Union and their fight against the Germans in World War II with this current conflict, right? But the real political point that it underlies is that what Russia wants is the Kremlin to gain a veto power over any other elected government that might enter Ukraine. And this is a pretty standard tactic, is to have elections, but those elections have a filter placed on them by usually an authoritarian government. So, for example, in Iran, there are elections in Iran, but a small theocratic council has to vet every candidate to make sure that they agree with the state party line, meaning that in effect, it is a one-party state. The same thing happened in Hong Kong, where Hong Kong still has free elections, but every candidate must be vetted by the CCP to ensure they don't have any subversive stances, meaning that in effect, every candidate is a CCP shill. And so this is the authority that the Kremlin wants to get, right? How else could Russia have an assurance that Ukraine does not have any Nazis winning an election? The answer is, of course, to say, well, we want that authority to veto candidates. Now, Lavrov is out here saying that any peace agreement must prevent what he calls, quote, the repetition of what brought the putschists. This is referring to the Euromaidan protests and the revolutions in which a pro-Russian shill was kicked out in a popular movement. Right? Any peace agreement must prevent the repetition of Pushis winning power through what he called the bloody revolution. It was bloody, but only because Viktor Yanukovych's thugs shot peaceful protesters. Right? And again, Lavrov repeated that Russian President Vladimir Putin is not the legitimate ruler of Ukraine, and that Russia could only negotiate with the leadership of Ukraine's parliament instead of Zelensky. But again, this is one of those weird Russian propaganda points where they say, oh, well, Zelensky's not legitimate. I can only negotiate with the parliament, which doesn't make any sense, because the parliament is the entity that could oust Zelensky. Worth noting, the Ukrainian constitution is clear that in the event that Ukraine is occupied by a foreign power, namely Russia, that there cannot be elections while martial law is implemented. This makes perfect sense because, as you can see, how exactly can Ukraine hold elections when numerous major cities and Ukrainian voters are under occupation, right? Mariupol, Melitopol, these are major cities, guys. These are not small nowheres. Donetsk city, you could see all of these regions, they have a right to vote too. They didn't surrender that right just because the Russian government is occupying them. Berdyansk. And so holding an election in these regions is kind of impossible, right? Doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Obviously, Crimea, they held elections since the Russian occupation of Crimea and the Donbass. But the state was not in a constant state of martial law. The other problem is, of course, that, well, in the military zone, every single week, Russia is seizing more and more villages. As we just talked about, how can you hold an election in a place like Sumy when Russian forces are actively on the march? It simply couldn't be done safely. So this is obviously just a pure Russian shill, and it's part of this Russian propaganda in order to create simply as much confusion and fear and doubt as possible, right? Because there doesn't have to be a cohesive, hold together ideology. Most members of the public don't hold cohesive, hang together ideologies, right? They just sort of have a constellation of random beliefs that suit them. And so the Russian government's propaganda theory is that they simply are going to lay out the biggest menu of possible ideas that every individual can pick and choose from. Because what's interesting is that while Vladimir Putin's propaganda says, hey, this reflects a anti-Nazi campaign, and harkens back to World War II. At the same time, he also believes that Russians are a superior race, that Russians are the natural and right rulers of Eastern Europe, and that as the superior race, it is their duty to dominate the Ukrainian group of people, that they are naturally subordinate to the Russians. And if you think that ideology sounds like, well, the other side of World War II, you wouldn't be wrong. In fact, there are at least as many neo-Nazis fighting for Russia as there are fighting for Ukraine, right? Neither side seems to have a ton, but the idea is that there is this wide range of beliefs, and you can simply make sure that the fight adheres to your ideology, right? Now, what's fascinating too, this is another example, right? There's also a religious dimension to the war, right? Russia also has this religious propaganda that they've got going on. So Lavrov, for example, has dismissed the Vatican peace talks, or the Vatican as a venue for possible peace talks, which is funny because we just heard that he isn't doing peace talks at all. And so he's dismissed this, saying that the seat of the Catholic government would not be an appropriate platform for negotiations between two Orthodox Christian nations. This is fascinating for a couple of reasons. First off, because there is a huge split between the Ukrainian and Russian Orthodox Church. In fact, the Russian Orthodox Church, right, has actually been seen as extremely complicit in the state's kind of reputation laundering of the war. And in some instances, the Ukrainian armed forces actually found that the Russian Orthodox Church and its members within Ukraine were actively working with Russian armed forces to provide intelligence, to store weapons, and to act as headquarters. But even within Russia, the Orthodox Church is doing things like blessing large formations, hosting these strange services that are kind of oriented around Russian military operations. You might note, for example, that failed assault along a gas pipeline in Suja that the Russian armed forces conducted. A Russian Orthodox Church actually took a replica of that pipe and put it outside of one of their churches as sort of a tribute to those soldiers that were killed in the operation. It's very bizarre stuff. And the Ukrainians, in turn, will say, no, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is a completely separate church with a completely separate religion. So you're seeing there's this religious layer that says it almost has a crusade-like character, where Russia says, no, we are both Orthodox nations. We are supposed to be one nation under Orthodox Christianity. The Ukrainians, in turn, say, no, we are our own branch of Orthodox Christianity. And so this idea that we are Orthodox countries, and so therefore we can't have conduct peace negotiations in a Catholic setting, is itself kind of reflects a fundamental Russian propaganda talking point. It's also worth noting that in some ways, right, the Vatican is you could say at the same time, the Vatican is a perfect venue because they are both Orthodox countries. It would be less perfect if they were two, either one country was Catholic and one was Orthodox, right? Then they would say, well, we can't host it in the Vatican. Vatican is obviously going to be overly favorable to the Catholic side. So this is just I think a symbol, for lack of a better term, of the really the way that the Russian sort of propaganda machine has really pivoted and begun to spin in a very different way. Now, I want to point out one other thing, right? It's not just the Russian diplomatic stance that has changed. In fact, Russia is continually upgrading its Iskander ballistic missiles to beat now the U.S. Patriot missile batteries. This is really troubling because these Iskanders now have radar decoy systems that make interception even more complicated. And this is, I think, the fundamental problem tactically or operationally that the West has found itself boxed into. Because the West... So fundamentally, the West made a decision with Russia and supporting Ukraine. They said, we're going to help Ukraine resist Russian aggression as per the, we're bound by treaty. But the resistance to this is going to be titrated. We're going to give them slowly, steadily, increasingly limited supplies, one thing at a time, so to speak, right? So you might recall that Russian forces operated for nearly 2 years before cluster munitions were deployed, right? Patriot missile batteries generally were given much earlier, but this sort of steady drip allows, it's sort of like playing a video game, right? In level 1, you might see low level enemies. And as you get proficient at taking out those low level enemies, you're going to see level 2 enemies, level 3 enemies, level 4 enemies. And each time you get better at playing, your character evolves with better gear and better experience. And so you are more capable of fighting those adversaries as they come in. But it only works if they are titrated in slowly, right? Imagine if you had to fight an end game boss with a level 1 character. It would be literally impossible. But essentially, what the U.S. has done for Russia by slowly providing each individual piece of its arsenal, right? Remember, a full NATO-trained and equipped brigade wasn't fielded until 2023. And even then, it was only a portion of the Ukrainian armed forces. All of these things combined to allow Russia to do exactly what has happened here, where because they did not suffer a decisive defeat, they are continually engineering better and better versions of their weapon systems, better able to thwart U.S. air defenses. And this is really troubling because the Patriot is the workhorse of the U.S. air defense artillery, right? The Ukrainians say that the Iskander-M has been improved and modernized. Each missile can now release radar decoys during its final approach to the target, confusing defensive systems. You also have Shaheds that are better able to, that are better able to thwart radar. They include a lot of dummy warheads. They include faster moving jet engines that are harder to detect and intercept, and extremely low flight patterns below, making it hard to detect them below the horizon, right? Of course, another factor is the improved maneuverability. The Iskanders no longer follow a true ballistic trajectory. It performs limited maneuvers, meaning it's harder for the Patriot system to sort of infer where that interception might take place, right? This is so incredibly troubling because what happens is that this isn't Russia alone that's going to have access to this information. We've talked about the fact that China has been a valuable financial and logistical partner for Russia in this, but China isn't doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it because they get to not only defeat and humiliate the West, but they also get to learn and grow their military to find all this technical data about how to beat each individual Western system. What tactics do you use to reduce the effectiveness of a cluster munition? What tactics do you use to reduce the effectiveness of a Patriot missile battery? What tactics do you use to defeat a heavy brigade combat team? All of these things are extremely valuable to the Chinese, right? As they are valuable to the North Koreans, who also look at the South Korean military and see a military that is equipped and trained much like the U.S. military. And so this is all part of a Russian strategy towards victory. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you so much to our Colonel tier members like James Porsche B. Himmerling, James Jade21, Yanko Georgiev, Chris Gorsuch, Paul Templeton, Cytronics. Thanks to everybody else. And be sure to hit that subscribe button. I could not do it without you guys. Again, subscribe, hit that subscribe button. Doesn't cost you anything. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.